Hello, and welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. And now, here's your host, Joe Dolce.
Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast. These are high-minded conversations for the post-prohibition era.
Hello, ASMR listeners.
I'm your host, Joe Dolce. Just waking up, and I'm here with co-host and co-producer Alan Seals. Good morning, Alan.
Good morning, Joe.
So nice to see you.
This isn't creepy at all.
This is really creepy, but that's okay. We just wanted to give our listeners a new start to the podcast. Don't you think it's a good idea?
I think it's something different. They'll turn us up and be like, what the actual...
What are these guys doing? What are these guys doing? You know, we have a really interesting show to this week. It's about the medicalization of marijuana. But hold on. It's quite interesting because cannabis is a medicine that doesn't behave like any other medicine. So it's got a problem. Where does it fit in? And how do we think about it? And it's not just about how we think about it. It's why it's so hard for doctors to really get their minds about it. We really are going to explore this issue and many other issues regarding it, but I'll leave you on this note before we get into it. Has there ever been a plant with as many personalities as cannabis?
No.
There hasn't been.
Not that I'm aware of.
And there's certainly not been a medicine like this either. It is a very unique substance. So what we're trying to do, I think, and this is the problem in some ways, is fit this round peg in a square hole. We're trying to fit cannabis into our typical ideas of what medicine is. And it's the problem is interesting, and our two guests, William Dolphin and Michelle Newhart, are going to talk about it in quite some good depth today. And listeners, I'd like to ask you, again, to consider supporting us on Patreon.
BraveNewWeed.com.
Patreon. It's a way that you can help us keep the lights on. You know, we are really dependent on crowdfunding. We're really dependent on your support. When we get a $10 a month contribution, a $20 contribution, a $50 a month contribution, I can tell you we are very happy people. We know we're going to be able to keep bringing you this podcast. So please, if you have it, if you know people that have it, if you work for a company that should be supporting us, please encourage them to throw us some dollars.
Or just one.
It's just one. You could do it for $1 a month if that's all you have, or that's all that's required. It helps us. We feel the love, and it helps us come to you every week after week after week
after week. Maybe we'll do an entire episode in ASMR.
You better tell everybody what AMSR means.
ASMR?
Because you don't even know what it means, do you?
ASMR is...
Say quiet, be quiet.
Oh. Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response.
Which means whispering.
Characterized by a static-like or tingling sensation on the skin that typically begins on the scalp and moves down the back of the neck and upper spine. It's been compared with auditory tactile synesthesia and may overlap with frisson. Sexy words.
Sexy, very sexy.
It leads us into a wonderful little interview, a comedic interview.
Well, I did an event a few weeks ago with a wonderful comedian. She does a science comedy show, which is the kind of thing that really only happens in New York City, which is why we like living in New York still. And this is Sarah Rose Siskind, smart woman, very funny, decided to, her show is called Drug Test. And what she decided to do is test her physical prowess using 3 substances. 1, ketamine, 2, MDMA, and 3, cannabis. And she did the presidential fitness test, right? She ran a mile, she did 100 sit-ups, I think she threw in a yoga pose, she did a few other things, and so, just to see how she would do on these various substances. And
what exactly is ketamine, real quick?
Special K, remember Special K?
Oh, yeah.
Ketamine.
Yeah.
Now there's a lot of research, like big research at Columbia University about using ketamine for depression, using ketamine to really help people get over serious anxiety states. And it's another one of these substances like LSD that has had all this crazy propaganda put behind it and turns out to be extremely useful. And it's been a recreational drug, of course, for many, many, many years. And now we're learning how to dose it and use it for other medical purposes.
I have never done ketamine. What kind of feeling does it give you?
Well, quite nice, actually. It's usually used for sexual recreational purposes. It can bring you closer. It's not a drug that you want to use to stand up and run a marathon, which is what made it interesting that Sarah tried it for that. I mean, it can make you feel a bit wobbly. So you feel like your body feels like it's drunk, but your mind doesn't. It's a very nice, very pleasant. You want to talk to people. You want to be in a room of people and talk. You want to be convivial. You want to connect. So Sarah put herself through these paces, and I just wanted to have a quick word. I want to have a much longer conversation with her, but I wanted her to tell the listeners what her experience was. And she has a very peculiar relationship to cannabis from our points of view. Here she is, Sarah Rose Siskind.
Listeners, you can join the conversation with Brave New Weed today by visiting us on any of our social media platforms. Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, all at Brave New Weed, will bring you to a place where you can like, comment, share the show, interact with other listeners, and keep the conversation going. Together, we are the world of Brave New Weed.
So, Sarah, you're at a cocktail mixer for people in the psychedelic space. Is that correct?
I am indeed, and I'm being very antisocial right now.
You are. It's so nice to talk to you. Welcome to the Brave New Weed podcast.
Thank you for having me, Joe.
So let me just tell the listeners, we met at an event that you hosted that was testing you decided to make yourself an experimental bunny and test your own physical prowess on 3 substances, which were
ketamine, MDMA, and then this third substance you probably have never heard of called cannabis, or I think it's cannabis. I'm not sure.
Cannabis.
There we go.
If you were in Israel, you would say it. Cannabis.
Really? Oh,
honestly,
awesome.
That's how we say it. Yeah. So, what did you do? Tell our listeners quickly what you did.
So
you're so good and fun.
Thank you, Joe. You're like,
wait, you got to tell people this was a science comedy festival, right?
Science in quotes. So what I did is a sort of cheeky way. I did the presidential fitness test, which is running 1 mile, doing as many sit-ups as you can, and doing as many push-ups as you can, and then I threw in yoga positions just to, spice things up.
Being the millennial that you are.
Being the millennial that I am indeed.
Okay.
Actually,
and then you did each of them on a dose of these particular substances, right?
Yes, exactly. And I had varying results. I found that on MDMA, I actually ran pretty well. I did slightly more sit-ups, and I did the same amount of push-ups.
Wait, did you hug more? Did you hug more people though?
And
as you were running around the track?
I hugged infinitely more people. I really did have a great experience that expedited my breakup, but did slow down my mile somewhat.
Wow. Okay. And was it easy to run on MDMA? Did it feel easy to you?
Absolutely not. It was because the thing was I'd read a bunch of studies about how MDMA can lower your body's ability to respond to signals saying you've passed your core temperature, and that's how people die of heat stroke. So I was really worried about, frankly, dying of heat stroke, but also wanting to hug everybody.
Oh, so sweet. Okay, so then there was ketamine. Now, ketamine makes one a little wobbly, as I remember from my dark days of ketamine use, which I never thought were very dark, actually. Did you feel wobbly as you were running around the track?
I did. I felt pretty darn drunk. That's kind of how I feel when I take ketamine, is like a little bit more coordinated, but drunk. And but somehow I managed to do like just a minute slower. So sober, I ran a 6:33 mile. On ketamine, I ran a 7:33 mile. So not too much slower. And I actually did significantly more sit-ups by like an order of magnitude, because as I said on camera, it felt like it was hurting somebody else's body.
But didn't you feel the ground wobbly like you were on a ship the whole time you were running?
That's a weird source of motivation, Joe.
Okay.
You can really tap into it. You can get into a flow state when you're trying to, like, when the floor is actually lava.
Okay. Third substance, cannabis. How was it for you?
So cannabis is it is my white whale. It is my bane of existence. I want it to work so badly, but it pretty much decreased my results in every single measurable way. In addition to that, while I was running the mile, I stopped about halfway to confide with my producer that I was really worried about getting skin cancer because the sun was too strong, and I was worried about dying. So I couldn't even finish a mile without having the paranoia overtake me.
Do you like cannabis? You don't really like cannabis, do you?
I don't. I really, really am been trying to make it work. I've tried every strain. I've been to Amsterdam. I've tried every method of ingestion. I have had very limited success, and I'm a huge supporter of people who have found it medicinal or therapeutic or just fun. But my gosh, I have never had anything remotely like that.
You've never had any fun?
I really have not. I mean, I tried writing a stand-up set once on pot because, I'm a comic when I'm not doing fitness tests on drugs. And, my parents are very proud. Anyway.
Yeah. I know. It made me proud of you, too. I was so happy to see you doing that. Go on.
I was trying to write a stand-up set, and I came up with one quote-unquote joke, which was just the question, do giraffes have Adam's apples? And that was it. So if that works, maybe I have a future, but I have a feeling.
Where was the joke? What's the joke?
The joke is just that. It's, do giraffes have Adam's apples? That's the end of the joke.
Forget cannabis. You are not meant for cannabis. But you have to do one. So do you think it's because you don't know how to take the right dose?
I think that that's possible. I think that I might, I was talking to a guy who was on my show named Ross Ribagliati, who you've probably talked to before and maybe have talked to on the show. He's an Olympian who smokes cannabis very medicinally. And
medicinally? You're crazy? He smokes every minute of every day.
He smokes it in every way. He smokes it therapeutically, medicinally, recreationally, horizontally, like
any way he can.
Any adverb, that's how he smokes it. He's convinced that I overdosed, and that's possible. But I don't know how to microdose, I guess, without not feeling it. It's a really quick difference from not feeling it to very much feeling it.
I think we're going to bring you on the show, and I'm going to do a microdose session with you, and we'll see how long you can do the interview.
I am already sweating.
All right. So by way of saying adieu, would you tell the readers the poem you wrote to me after your experience?
Okay, I will. Oh, I realize I have to bring it up. Just 1 second. By the way, you are like my muse. Yeah. I did not plan on writing this.
Nobody's ever called me a muse before. I'm so glad.
Okay.
I'm actually very pleased.
All right.
Okay.
So in answer to your continual questioning about whether or not I like cannabis, I was inspired by the great works of Dr. Seuss. And this is my answer to you.
You do like cannabis, right? You have to if you like Dr. Seuss. Go
on. Keep trying, Joe. Keep trying. All right.
Go on.
I would not, could not, with a vape. I will not, in a crepe. I do not like them, either strain. I do not like them in my brain. Not hot, nor box, nor here, nor there. I do not like them anywhere. Not with a pen, not CBD, not buttered treats, you let me be. I do not like them green or gray. I do not like them Joe Dolce.
Oh, bravo.
Thank you.
That was a beautiful recitation. Sarah, how can people tune into your show or come and see your show in New York?
Just go to drugtest.com or look us up on Facebook, or just, smoke a whole bunch and whisper it into the wind and I will appear.
I'm so glad. I'm going to come and see you every month in New York City and wherever else you go. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks
today.
for having me on, Joe.
Our guests this week are William Dolphin and Michelle Newhart. These are two very smart people who've been on the cutting edge of cannabis and research for for many, many years. I'm very happy to have them join us. And what we're going to be talking about is, this idea that cannabis should be treated like a medicine the way we think of all other medicines. And you have to listen to the interview to really understand the depth of this problem, because it's been so unusual. Cannabis, as a medicine, cannabis was considered a medicine for time immemorial, except for the last 80 years. Mm-hmm. Okay? So it's now reintegrating itself back into this idea of what medicine is. And we're at a time where we're also rethinking what medicine is, right? People we think about wellness now. We think about self-care. We think about how to use supplements to prevent illness before it's happening, right? We know right now that some of the side effects of medicines and yes, when you have a serious illness, you want serious medicine, of course. But not all illnesses are created equal. And certainly not all medicines are created equal. And this is going to talk about, what I love about this interview is the way these two folks really break out the nuance and talk about the problems of trying to fit cannabis into the models that currently exist, right? Cannabis is not a medicine that just turns the body temperature up and down, is it? It really responds to how your body is at the moment, and as your body is over your life. I've talked about this many times, that as a person of a certain age, I'm more sensitive to cannabis. I'm more sensitive to alcohol. I'm more sensitive to medicines in general. Nobody's talking about this yet, okay? But we all have different responses to the plant and at different points in our life, and I really want to encourage you to have a listen to this interview with William Dolphin and Michelle Newhart. William Dolphin, Michelle Newhart, thank you for joining me so much on the Brave New Weed podcast. This is a topic I'm really looking forward to talking about, which is the medicalization of marijuana. Tell me the title of your co-authored new book, folks. One of you, please.
Sure. It's The Medicalization of Marijuana, Legitimacy, Stigma, and the Patient Experience.
Great. What's the concept of this book? It's an academic book. It's great. It's easy to read. It's really interesting. What was the driving question that you set out to answer? Michelle.
Sure. When I started this project, it started as a sociology dissertation. And it was around the time that everything expanded in Colorado, where in 2009, 9 years into Colorado's program, there were 5,000 people enrolled in their medical cannabis program. And by the end of 2010, there were 125,000 people who had applied. So this seemed like an incredible push-pull situation with how public policy works. And I became interested in talking to patients about their experiences in the program. We ended up focusing on patients who were at midlife or older. And the beginning of the study was really thinking about, my research had been about how patients generally decide to use any type of health treatment that is outside of biomedicine. So nutritional supplements and this type of stuff. So that was what I was studying right before I had embarked on this project. And cannabis use looked a little bit like these other uses. And I was very interested to see if patients who adopted medical cannabis use, if their use looked like the use of other nutritional supplements or other medicines, or if it looked different. So that was a simple question that we started with. And then we ended up looking at all of the different decision points that patients face when they decide that this might be a solution for them. So we looked at how they decided whether to try it in the first place, and then each decision point about how to get a recommendation, how to decide how to get a supply, how to determine a routine for their use that was effective for their condition, and also how they decided to share this information or to keep it to themselves, if they decided to disclose this use and who they decided to disclose that to. In other words, issues around risk and stigma. And so the book walks through their progress through this system in that way.
Got it. So what did you guys learn? It's too big of a question to ask what you learned here, but William, explain your concept, your participation in the book quickly, please.
Sure. Well, so Michelle did the data collection, the interviews, and wrote the dissertation. She had called me at the point where she was making a decision about whether or not to pursue it, because we had worked on projects related to cannabis prior to that, and she knew that I had a longstanding relationship with Americans for Safe Access, the patient advocacy organization that involved talking to lots of patients and being generally aware of the things. So my contribution, I think, was a certain amount of support initially. And then after it was completed and she was done, she asked me to help turn that dissertation into the book. And so that entailed, reworking some of the material and bringing in some new stuff, putting more context around some of the law and policy considerations that has been more my focus over the last 17 or 18 years.
Great. So let's talk about, I think most patients really don't understand what medical cannabis is versus recreational use. I have my definition of what it is, which is finding the minimal effective dose to find relief for your symptoms. What's your definition of what medical cannabis is? Either one of you.
Sure. Well, I would say my definition as a social scientist is maybe less important than thinking about how patients talked about it. And what we discovered about how patients talked about it actually matches pretty well with what you just said your definition was, which is patients at least eventually arrive at the definition that they are trying to minimize the amount of medication taken and minimize the symptoms of their disease or illness while maximizing function. And this fits a mini-max strategy because you're minimizing those things and maximizing function that Nikki Britton, a sociologist who studies the use of medicines generally, had coined it mini-max. And, but an interesting thing is that patients don't start out necessarily with that idea. Most people go through some form of education, both an experiential education and also changing their conceptual understanding of cannabis along the way. And we found that whether people had zero background in cannabis and were learning everything for the first time, or whether they were a recreational user prior to that, they really didn't start out with their head wrapped around what medical cannabis was, and maybe weren't even sure they believed that it could be medical.
Yeah, I know. The last 80 years of prohibition have really done an amazingly effective job, haven't they? This thing has been used medically for 5,000 years. Suddenly, 80 years come along and we wipe out its medical application. Pretty amazing, huh?
Well, it is, and it reflects what we call in the book a single story about cannabis that emerged in the last 80 years under prohibition. And it basically says cannabis is one thing, and its use is for one purpose, and that's intoxication, and that's enormously problematic. And that washes away, of course, the many, many uses of cannabis, both in terms of ingesting it and otherwise. And that has been really an infectious story. It has affected both the general public, it's affected policymakers, it's affected how scientists view their own data.
Absolutely. I love the way you called it the demedicalization of marijuana. I called it sort of the multiple personality ification of marijuana, because you describe it as killer weed, dropout drug, stoner thing, and then science. And it's been through these various I don't know, iterations, you might say, for 80 years. And it's, every 20 years or so, the story seems to change a bit when, when it's no longer known as the killer weed, then it becomes the drug of laziness, the drug of sloth, right? Or then it becomes the drug of rebellion, as Richard Nixon put it. So it's quite interesting. It's been able to absorb an awful lot of, let's say, personality shift over the years.
Well, and I think that's an interesting point to bring up, because this is the short history, which is a very strategic history. It's been deployed strategically and symbolically over the last 80 years. And so those claims have changed in some part based on the opportunistic claims that could be attached to it in order to accomplish, political or other goals. But the bigger story of cannabis has always included cannabis as a medicine. And
Absolutely.
Even in this 80 years, it's been, filled with constant skirmishes around whether there are other applications, rather, including as a medicine. That debate has been there the entire time.
Absolutely.
So this is, it's a short run versus a long run history. And I think looking at the broader picture, it's undeniable that it's always had a story that's related to its medical value.
It seems to me that, I have a medical cannabis education platform called Medical Cannabis Mentor that our listeners know. But and in doing it, I spoke to an awful lot of healthcare professionals across the board. And the overwhelming observation I have is that doctors, MDs, struggle much more than patients with the idea of medical cannabis.
Well, that kind of fits with an argument that we have in the book about how there's a division between system and life world logics. And a system logic is one that is employed by institutions. It's one that you're taught if you become a professional in a field to look at it from a point of view of efficiency, to look at how you look at information is more critical and probably more narrow of what constitutes evidence. And you're looking at it as it affects a larger number of people, whereas Life World tends to be focused on your holistic life experience, quality of life, the meaning, relationships, and a concern with your overall functioning.
Yes, and how you feel.
Yeah, how you feel. And people making logical decisions in the life world are willing to draw on all types of evidence, for better or worse. I mean, sometimes that's not necessarily, you don't want people using everything they read on the internet or something to make their determinations about things, but it is a much more diverse information environment in which anecdotes and all types of information would be included.
And as we point out, it's also important to recognize the role of stigma in this, because people associated with cannabis are stigmatized, have historically been stigmatized. So coming into this, whether you're going to make a decision to use it or you're going to make a decision as a physician or other healthcare professional to recommend it to a patient, you have to grapple with that. The patient obviously derives a direct benefit from making the decision. They may have an answer to something that they're trying to treat. So that's very direct, that's very tangible. Physicians don't derive much benefit from it, right? They risk reputational problems. They risk investigation by the medical board. They risk just being classified as one of those doctors. And many physicians are quite upfront about expressing their concerns about that. Even if they recognize that there are legitimate applications for this as a medicine, they will refuse to recommend it because they don't want the risk.
Yeah, those are the institutional restrictions that you were talking about. I mean, the other problem is, of course, physicians have to learn about it. And it's not take 2 pills and call me in the morning, darling. It's a very different, botanical medicine is a different strategy of dosing. Don't you agree?
Absolutely. And one of the points we make in the book is that marijuana may be the ultimate life world medicine. If we think about the logic of the life world and this idea of quality of life, it actually fits there because, first of all, it's just inherently safe. There's no overdose potential that can kill you that we have with many other prescription drugs. And even if you use too much of some foods or even water, you can hit a point of overdose that we haven't yet found with this substance. So extraordinarily safe. And there are all kinds of studies out there in the medical side about how to get people to comply with medical regimens. Well, this doesn't have quite the same problem with compliance because there's also a euphoric quality to it that may encourage people to use it, and yet the addictive potential is very low, if at all. Their dependence is very low. And so it's a highly flexible medication that the individual has to determine the dosage that's appropriate for them, and no one else can tell them exactly what that is at this point with how where we are with the science of this.
Yeah.
And so
maybe we never will be able to, by the way.
We may never be able to.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, and the variability of the plant and the variability of individual physiologies, would suggest that you won't, and with good reason. And that relates to how the endocannabinoid system functions on a really basic level. Because when you bring in exogenous cannabinoids, phytocannabinoids, you're using cannabis medicines of some sort, you're affecting what is the master regulatory system of your body. So it's not just a stimulant. It's not just a depressant. It doesn't just turn the dial up or just turn the dial down. It reacts to how the individual's body is set at the moment. So there's little way to predict that with our current science, and it's also going to change over time. So the same individual, from one point in their life to another may have extremely different experiences of it.
I've certainly noticed this, and I don't hear many people talking about it, but as I've aged, I've become much more sensitive to cannabis, to alcohol as well, to many substances. My body has clearly changed. I could never use what I used to use when I was 20.
Well, and interestingly, I've heard anecdotal reports from patients that report similar things, that over time, the amount of cannabis needed to achieve symptomatic relief can decrease.
Absolutely. I mean, so my partner in medical cannabis mentor, Dr. June Chin, she's a very unusual doctor because what she likes about cannabis, and she's very upfront about saying this, is that you don't really need her as a doctor. It's like, we'll get you started, and then you're off and running. Once I show you how to adjust your dose and you can figure out an optimal place to stay, you don't have to call me. Now, that really goes against the medical model in the United States at the moment, doesn't it?
Well, sure, but also tons of social science and behavioral studies about medicine will tell you that having some agency, having some control by the patient and their ability to manage their condition are powerful in and of itself as a characteristic of a medicine. So that's to the benefit of the patient to be able to exert that control.
Absolutely. And again, I think we have to educate patients that that's a plus, not a minus, right? Because so many patients just want to turn control over to the doctor, a system, a something, and say, okay, treat me, make this go away. It's very interesting, I think, an interesting problem that's come across when I started looking at this.
It's also fair to note that physicians have some work to do on that too, because it runs somewhat counter to expectations around normal medications. And one of the issues with that is simply a lack of education about cannabis and cannabinoid medicines in medical schools.
Absolutely.
It's not part of anyone's board exam, so it's not taught.
That's right. So let's go through some of the typical medical physician opposition to using cannabis. I think it's interesting and I think it's instructive. So point number one, there is no clear optimal dose. I mean, we may have talked about this briefly, but even the way one inhales is different from person to person. How does that strike you as an objection?
Well, it's not that different from at least some other medications. If you talk to any psychiatrist and ask, what's the optimal dose for treating depression? They'll laugh at you.
That's right.
That's just not how it works. You start with a first-line medication. You start with the lowest possible dose. You see what effect you get. You up the dose until you see an effect. That doesn't work. You switch medications. That doesn't work. You switch medications again. It's always a trial and error with some conditions and some medications.
Absolutely. Insulin is another one. People who are diabetic, they have to check their blood sugar every day practically when things are going awry, and they need to adjust their insulin dose. And they learn. How to do it.
Indeed. And again, that is, something that requires agency on the part of the patient and more feedback, communication with the doctor than maybe true of other things. It's obviously not so much true of antibiotics or some other medications where the protocols are much clearer.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Here's another one. Because of regulatory standards of regular pharma versus cannabis, they vary state to state. And then, of course, the composition, the purity, and the concentration of the active cannabinoids are also going to vary a lot.
Well, I would just say, the title of our
is?
book is The Medicalization of Marijuana. And what we meant by that title was that we're taking something that's been taken out of medicine and it's being reintegrated into a medical use. And in that process, it's being reintroduced into the institutions and the culturally being grouped as a medicine. But there's still, and that's brought a lot of benefits with it in terms of greatly expanding the methods by which you can take it and just introducing a lot more science and concern with things like what pesticides and what other elements are being used in the production of it to make sure it's safe and to be able to measure these constituents and really start thinking about how to create formulations that are going to work for different disorders. So it's brought a lot to the table, but I still think medical doctors want it to fit into the system as it exists. They want it to be standardized so it does look like other medications and other prescriptions. And I think it doesn't fit that. It doesn't fit that yet. It may well eventually have some versions of it that fit that. And yet I think it would be a mistake to lose what the whole plant can do for many other problems and conditions.
I agree. I think what's missing is the definition that this is a botanical medicine and that it fits with the idea of what botanical medicines are, but it doesn't fit the idea of what a pharmacological medicine is. That's what always seems to strike me. Botanical medicines are more amorphous. They do require agency, as you say. They do require self-awareness of the body, and you have to pay attention to it. It's not simply take it and go away.
I think that's right. And, it's a classification issue that has plagued cannabis and is, arguably, why it should not be a scheduled substance at all. But to the previous point about dosing and standardization and consistency,
yes.
One of the things we found in talking to patients was that they all were striving for exactly that. They wanted to be able to predict how what they were taking was going to affect them. It did take some experiment, right? But again, with that mini-max strategy that Michelle was talking about, you're trying to maximize function. If you take too much, you may have a problem. If you take too little, you may have a problem. If you get a different variety or a different product, you may have a problem because it's not going to produce the same effects as the last one you had. So it's very common for patients to go to great lengths to try to control for that, either by maintaining a consistent supply of exactly the same type of product, measuring out dosages very carefully, so that, again, they have very predictable results. And it's the same thing that doctors are concerned with. It's just a slightly different process for getting there.
So one of my big issues with our current medical marijuana system or non-system or many systems is that really the people on the front lines are working in dispensaries, and typically they're earning $12 to $15 an hour, and they have very little education other than I got really ripped last night. This is an enormous problem for me as a patient. It was a problem for me when I began using, and it's an enormous problem for me as an adult and as an educator and as a thinking person. Like, this is not the most efficient way or the most effective way to get medicines, or whatever you want to call them, into the hands of people who need them. What do you guys think about this way of working?
I agree. One of the things that the book talks about is that medicalization of cannabis remains incomplete. And as a result, medical cannabis spans all realms of medicine, from the biomedical, by needing to interact with formal medicine in order to get a recommendation, and then that the dispensary system could be seen as a type of complementary alternative medicine outlet, and yet, and then finally, when you're using it, you're relying on self-care to a large degree. A lot of that is determined independent of any particular advice. You may take advice from a dispensary. You may look online or crowdsource various things through different social media or online outlets, or read books, but to a large degree, you may be on your own. Although I think we're seeing a lot of great entrepreneurial initiative out there of people from all realms of life trying to help provide better information and education and develop protocols from sort of a grassroots perspective. But the dispensary is not the best, always the best place for medical information. And I think William kind of likes to talk about some of the aspects of this when it comes to how patients operate. So,
William, over to you then. There's a handoff for you.
Thank you very much. Yes. Well, one of the things that we found in talking to patients is that they get their information through lateral networks, friends, family members, not so much from doctors. And what we see, even with the dispensary folks that you're talking about, is there's a real challenge around what counts as expertise with this. Who do I go to for expert advice? And when the FDA is telling you it's not a medicine at all and there is no medical use, you're pretty sure it's not them. And when your doctor is expressing skepticism or refusing to really help you with it by way of writing a recommendation, it may not be the doctor either. And the doctor is likely going to be very clear that they don't have real advice in terms of how to actually manage your use.
Yep.
So, again, as Michelle said, we are seeing more sort of crowdsourced sorts of information gathering. There are apps out now for people's phones, some of which link directly to vaporization devices. So the device measures the dose, it logs it directly into the phone app. That information can be shared with a doctor, and tracks it, keeps a log of it for the patient and the medical professional to try to better manage the care. And at the same time, building databases of effects, right? So you used this strain or variety or whatever we're going to call it, and you had this effect from it. But again, in terms of the standardization, there's real challenges because just because you got a particular variety by this name at the dispensary, if you show up a month later, are you getting the same thing if it has the same name? And testing has shown that the answer is no.
Absolutely.
So, this is a significant challenge, again, for maintaining consistency. And there are folks who are being very systematic about it. Israel is really leading the way in terms of, systematically collecting information about different cannabis products and their effects and how that correlates.
It's a little easier for them because they have a very limited number of strains in Israel also. I mean, it is not California. Let's put it that way.
That's an interesting point.
They really have a very their cannabis is not what I would call connoisseur quality. I would say anyway, based on my limited experience. So they can control it more easily. In a place like California, it's been growing and hybridizing and bringing in seeds from all over the world, often illegally, over the last 60 years. It's a whole different, genetic mix. Actually, it's quite interesting. Am I interrupting you? Did you want to say something?
Well, I was just going to say it's great to see all of the innovation that's coming out from the lowering of the lowering of the perception of risk, along with the interest in the new science that has really come out around this, the discovery of the endocannabinoid system and the receptors and the natural ligands. And but I think, social science also has something to contribute, and it really is around this area of how people behave and thinking about, there's a reason why our subtitle of our book is about legitimacy, stigma, and the patient experience, because the very thing that you're talking about, this information, looking for information without incurring risk. The risk level had to lower in order for people to be willing to seek out this information. We saw people largely seeking it out through lateral networks of people they already knew, where it didn't feel like as big of a reputational risk to ask that person or to pass along that information to, say, family members or close friends. And yet that type of information transfer is filled with both good and wrong information. So we found that everybody had some piece of information that was incorrect, even if they had done a lot of self-education around this. So that's something that we could see improve as legitimacy improves and the education environment improves.
Most certainly. I have to say, one of the things that struck me, I was at a conference in Florida a couple of months ago, and some doctor was standing up on stage, and he was insisting that this is not a safe product yet. We haven't done clinical safety trials. And I have to tell you, the audience, which was mostly people in the business world, stood up and started booing him. And I thought that was astounding and, to me, very, very heartwarming, because I was saying to William before we began recording that one of my very first interviews when I started reporting Brave New Weed was with Dr. Lester Grinspoon, who wrote a seminal book in the 1970s called Marijuana Reconsidered. And one of his points to me was, this is the most used and observed substance in the history of, in recorded history. It has been used all over the world by everybody, and there has, as you said, never been one recorded fatality. So the medical profession, when they talk about safety trials, are going to insist upon the 15-year clinical safety trial process, which to me is, I don't understand how intellectually you can stand up for that as a thinking human being, given the history of use of this plant. Can either of you respond to me, tell me I'm crazy, or tell me I'm, of course, or I'm a genius, of course. But how is that intellectually defensible?
Well, as Michelle mentioned earlier, it's because you employ a system logic that says all that information does not matter. Because we define safety as successful completion of a phase 3 clinical trial. If you don't have a phase 3 clinical trial successfully completed, you haven't shown me that it's safe. And that was the basis of the FDA's rejection of the most recent rescheduling petition.
That's right.
So, it's a sort of letter of the law type of reading that ignores all that other stuff. And it is fair to say, in addition to what Dr. Grinspoon rightly noted about, the long history of it, that in terms of scientific modern study of harm, that has been extraordinarily extensive. Because the U.S. federal government and others have been eager to fund any type of research that would show some type of physical harm related to cannabis use. That has been the agenda of NIDA and a lot of other agencies. So we've looked over and over again at population studies, trying to find where's the thing that happens to people who use cannabis chronically. And it's just not there.
Those studies have been going on since 1972, I believe, correct?
Well, there have been a number
That's when NIDA was begun, right? NIDA was started in 1972. Richard Nixon, I think, inaugurated it. Am I correct?
I'm actually not 100% clear on NIDA's founding date, but the 1970s was the start of a lot of looking at it because cannabis use in the United States was growing in popularity. It was becoming more of a thing, and you had the passage of the 1970s Controlled Substance Act, which classified it as a Schedule I drug. But when that happened, Congress noted that they were not sure about that the evidence was inconclusive. And we had an immediate, study that found, a federally funded one initiated by the White House that said cannabis use is not a problem in the way that the law would indicate. And every serious look at it since then has concluded similar things.
You're speaking about the Shafer Commission report.
Correct. Which mirror the findings of the LaGuardia report back in, in
the 1940s. Yeah.
Right.
So all of these are available. One can see them. They're in the National Archives. They're all readable to the entire world. They're all available. And I just want to say for listeners, NIDA means the National Institutes of Drug Abuse. And their mandate is to look and see how drugs negatively affect people. They are not looking at the health benefits of the plant.
And that's produced one of the challenges with research in the United States. So Schedule I classification creates barriers to research in and of itself. The federal government has an extra review process for cannabis research that applies to no other substance. But once you get past all of that, you have an FDA approval for your research study. The only place you can go for research materials is to NIDA. They have to provide it to you, and they have been reluctant to do so in many cases.
Yeah, they figured that out. They figured out how to bureaucratically stranglehold this. So,
I
spent a lot. Yes, Michelle.
I also think that this is a great argument for our theory or our claim that this is about having a single story. That the federal government has used its authority to create and maintain and enforce a single story. And that concept of the single story comes from a great TED Talk by an author who did a talk about the dangers of a single story, which talks about the idea of it's really a base about stereotypes. It's about seeing something as one-dimensional based on what coverage you've heard and the consequences of that in terms of how you decide to interact with people from different cultures or different races. And it's a great talk. But in this case, we also see how that's enforced by power to say that. And the basic argument is cannabis use has one purpose. It's intoxication. It's used by one type of person for one reason. Every use is the same. Every cannabis plant is the same. Oh, and let's just append hemp on there too, and count that as one and the same. And so there's this is a very simplistic story. But that's one of the reasons why it's been so effective. They've defended that story at every turn. And this has helped to maintain a rhetoric that's stuck. It's instead of manufacturing doubt, you're manufacturing harm. You're manufacturing a single story of harm that allows for no other interpretation of this thing. And because it's simple, it's easy to reinforce over and over again in a lot of different ways. Yeah. And it means that every time it has come up against evidence, no matter from how legitimate of a source, that pushback to maintain that story is partly how we've gotten here. I mean, it supports prohibition. It supports current policies. So,
well, what I find interesting, though, is it's a single story, but with lots of chapters within it. For example, it will, in the beginning, it will create affection between the races. It will cause white women to sleep with black men. That was an overt message. Yes. It will then cause laziness. It will then cause, it will deform your brain. Mm-hmm. It will get in the way of your intellectual capacity. These are different stories that they've managed to put out with complete temerity, I would say, a lot of balls to change the story so dramatically, and with wide acceptance. Well, it's very impressive, I have to say.
Well, and let's not forget where we started, which is it will make you insane and violent.
That's right.
And that one is now reemerging quite remarkably just in the last few months. We've seen a reemergence of this, largely at the hands of a journalist and thriller writer who produced a book that tries to relitigate all that.
Another work of fiction, as I would say. Yes, another work of fiction.
Well, cherry-picking data and misrepresenting research. And we see this all the time, where there's just, I mean, you said sort of intellectual dishonesty, and on some level that may be true. You know, people are aware of who funds them and, what gets them attention. But at the same time, I think we should not discount the power of framing. If you have been raised to believe that it's a harmful drug, that it's a drug of abuse, all drugs of abuse are dangerous, then that's the interpretive framework that you're going to bring to everything. And, confirmation bias is a powerful thing for everyone. You find the things that confirm the thing you already believe.
Yeah. Yeah, it is amazing. I remember with my mom, who was suffering with depression towards the end of her life, would never, ever, 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 ever smoke a joint. But when I put a pain patch of cannabis on her, she was only too happy to have it, very happy to get the results of the reduction in pain, and loved the euphoria. She began singing. She hadn't sung a song in many years, actually, as a result of it. Her confirmation bias was completely shattered. And when I said to her, "Mom, you've now taken marijuana," she, "No, I did not. That's ridiculous." But she loved it.
Well, no, I think that direct experience is very compelling, and that's what we found among patients too. Yeah. I mean, they were often convinced by other people's direct experience, somebody close to them who they saw transform in that way, which was, the most convincing evidence you could have. And then if they had
that, and that was true of the doctors too,
they tended to pass that along. And as William said, that was doctors as well. In the absence of evidence that's in journals that doctors read and so forth, a lot of doctors also base their opinion on this in part on their own personal experiences that were either positive or negative to determine what they believe about it.
So I don't want this to be a screed against the medical profession, but I'm not at all convinced that doctors, as it stands today, should be the guardians of medical cannabis. And I'd like to know your thoughts on if anybody, who should be.
Well, gatekeeping is an important function of doctors in terms of medication use, and that relates to risk. So again, if there's a general recognition that this is a low-risk substance to use, classifying it as an over-the-counter drug, you don't need to talk to your doctor about taking an aspirin, is perhaps not unreasonable. Is there any gatekeeping really necessary is an important question to grapple with here. But there is an underlying concern that is valid, which is that cannabis can be such an effective medicine for managing symptoms that if someone is entirely self-treating something, say, like chronic pain, and is never determining what the underlying cause of that chronic pain is, then you may have a condition that is directly treatable by some other means, but it's never diagnosed.
Yes, good point. Very good point. So what's your big concept there?
Well, the big concept is that, I think allowing patients the opportunity to talk to their physicians directly and honestly and straightforwardly about the potential to use cannabis to treat conditions is important. And as long as we're operating in the kind of current set of circumstances where it is not really medicalized, it's not really accepted, where there is considerable stigma that causes patients to be concerned about how their doctor is going to judge them if they bring up the topic, then we have a problem. There was a study done in Colorado, parallel surveys of doctors and patients about, are you using medical cannabis? Do you know if your patient's using medical cannabis? And it found that basically about half of the patients who were using medical cannabis were not telling their physician they were doing so. And that is problematic. You want to have those open lines of communication so that people can be properly treated.
And I would think doctors would really want to know. I would think. But what I think is not what the world, I am not a part of the systematic structure that Michelle was so wonderfully speaking about. So,
well, I also think,
final question.
There's a spectrum. What? And I think that's what I was trying to get at before, where I'm excited about the developments on the medical side by medical researchers and by physicians and cannabis nurses. I think there's a lot of great work being done there that needs to be done. And I think that is helping to break down this single story by showing some things that I don't think any of us may have expected when this whole experiment began, in terms of its real potential as a medicine. And also, I think we're finally, at least at the forefront of this, we're finally getting over this idea that cannabis is one thing.
Absolutely. And I have to say, I find nurses incredibly open to the idea of using medical cannabis, and very open to learning about it and very open to bringing it to patients. They to me seem like perhaps the best gatekeepers for it, if I can state such an apostille.
Well, and I just want to suggest, too, that, we're sort of speaking about it in a sort of totalizing way again, like it is one thing. And as Michelle was mentioning, I mean, there's a lot of very exciting development around trying to isolate certain components of the plant, try to better understand how they work together, and how you might create more targeted medications that could help people's endocannabinoid systems function better. NIH
Absolutely.
researchers, reviewing all the available literature about 5 years ago said it appears that almost all disease states in humans are related to endocannabinoid function. So
that was George Kunos, head of the NIH. Indeed,
so,
yes.
I mean, if we're saying that your ECS may be a target for treating anything that goes wrong, well, you can't just point a fire hose at that. You want more targeted, more careful kinds of approaches, and that's the realm of drug development. That's where pharmaceutical companies may have a role. That's where physicians have the ability to help patients directly, while at the same time allowing for the type of whole plant, more broad botanical approach that has been so effective for so many people for so long.
You guys are utterly rational, utterly intelligent, and I thank you for being on this podcast and for writing your book. Tell us the name again, please.
It's called The Medicalization of Marijuana, Legitimacy, Stigma, and the Patient Experience.
And the easiest place to find it is?
You can find it on our website, which is the name of the book, Medicalization of Marijuana, or it's published by Routledge, so you can find it on Routledge or on Amazon.
Thank you again for joining me. It has been a pleasure, and I look forward to speaking to you further as our lives continue.
Thanks very much, Joe. It's been great.
Thank you so much.
The Brave New Weed podcast is an advocate and supporter of the Medical Cannabis Mentor platform. Medical Cannabis Mentor is an evidence-based educational platform for doctors, dispensaries, and patients that uses state-of-the-art online learning technology to educate you in today's modern cannabis world. You can find out more information by visiting medicalcannabismentor.com.
So, Alan, did you have any brilliant thoughts about that interview?
Other than I was disappointed that it wasn't all in ASMR or whispered. It's interesting to me that there is such a hard time categorizing this plant as a single type of medicine. Like, what is it exactly good for? What can physicians prescribe it exactly to do?
It just doesn't fit a doctor's mind. A traditionally trained doctor, It doesn't fit that mindset. So, that's why it's going to fall into the realm of alternative. Mm-hmm. And I think that's maybe where some of the great breakthroughs are going to happen in the world of alternative medicine. I mean, I'm working with doctors and other people who make formularies, right? Trying to create new ways of blending cannabis with other nutraceuticals or with other vitamins. And there's a huge scientific body of evidence around this about molecular medicine, right? But because it's put under the realm of alternative, it doesn't get the seriousness that is its due. But I believe that is going to change, and I think cannabis meds, CBD meds that are activated with THC are really going to change the game. I think
the term alternative medicine, to me personally, that gives it a bad connotation, because I'm someone, I'm a physician's son. My dad was a neurologist, and so it was always like, oh, you got a headache, do this for it, or you got a backache, do that for it, or whatever it is, there's that one thing, cause and effect, right? And so, like, alternative medicine, nothing against chiropractors, but what is
your father would not?
No, my father was not in favor of chiropractors. No. Alternative medicine, there's like the energy healers, there's tinctures that people make in their backyards, whatever it is. Like, I think that's sort of a catch-all that I believe is unfair if we categorize marijuana in that with everything else. Like, it should have its own subcategory that is not mainstream medicine, but not as sort of as off the wall as some of the really alternative medicines. Yeah,
it's not a woo-woo thing. I mean, there is real science behind it. So I think that's going to happen, and we're going to be doing many more podcasts on those sorts of products, especially as things like CBD just explode all over the world. People really need to understand what is good, what is bad, what is useful, what is useless. So thank you for your thoughts. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. It was really great to hear from you this week. And tune in again. We'll bring you some other fantastic shows at other really interesting volumes.
If you want an entire episode whispered like this, just let us know. We'll do it. Because it's kind of fun.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Brave New Weed podcast. This episode and all future episodes are made possible by amazing listeners like yourself. If you like what you've heard, we encourage you to show your support by giving $1 a month for special access and rewards on patreon.com/bravenewweed. You can also follow us on Twitter and Instagram via @bravenewweed. Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/bravenewweed. And remember, you can always find more information about us or information discussed in each episode by pointing your favorite browser to bravenewweed.com.